Recently I recorded a video about a great opening for black to counter the white's first move pawn to d4, the queen's gambit. You guys loved it, sent me a lot of positive feedback, and therefore I've decided to record a continuation, showing you some common ideas for black, attacking patterns, plans, making it even easier for you to win with the Dutch defense. Now the beauty of this system overall is that we are actually playing a system. It is not dependent on particular moves, you just play out the system regardless of what your opponent does, and it gives you a nice attacking position. So here I want to play bishop b4, which black did, pitting the knight right here. After this, white played queen c2, supporting the knight so that if black trades, white doesn't have to double their pawns, but they can recapture with the queen. Black castles, pawn e3, white just wants to develop, and pawn b6. The bishop certainly does not have bright future along this diagonal, and therefore we want to reroute it to this long diagonal, which is going to be great. From here, we're controlling the center, we're also putting the pressure down there to the king side, where we anticipate white to castle, which he did, and therefore this bishop will help us to fight for the center, and also to attack his king. Now, another important idea to remember is that notice that prior to this move, prior to the castling, the knight was pinned down to the king. And therefore our bishop on b4 fulfilled some important role, and this knight could not move because it was pinned down to the king, which used to be there on e1. However, after white have castled, the knight is free to go, and usually that is the right moment for you to capture it, where it is no longer pinned. Because if instead you just try to complete your setup, and let's say you play pawn d6 trying to go knight to d7, notice that this bishop has no way out here, right? These pawns are blocking the bishop out, and sometimes white can even play a crazy move just to go knight b1, simply to not let black to trade it off, and then to play like a3, pawn b4, and even capture this bishop altogether, and certainly you don't want that. Once again, to sum up, as soon as your opponent castles away from this pin, you want to grab this knight on c3. The queen recaptures. That also enables us to play another key move of our setup, to play knight to e4. The knight is really well placed here, supported by the pawn, supported by the bishop, and also we hit the queen, and generally speaking puts a lot of pressure to our opponent's position. Now white played queen d3 to remove the queen from danger, but now rook to f6. This rook lift is another common idea, common attacking pattern of black. We've got this bishop from b7, which is a sniper bishop, putting this long-term pressure towards his castling, and by now your opponent probably does not even realize how bad it's going to be for him within just a couple moves. Now I want to add the rook into our attack using this rook lift. We're also taking advantage of the fact that thanks to the Dutch defense, we have our pawn on f5, which gives us this space to move the rook around. And we're going to bring it either right here to g6 to target the king, or right here to h6 also to support our attack. So both of these ideas certainly make a lot of sense for black. I'd say that in most cases you wish to put it to g6 just because the rook will work really well together with the bishop to put pressure down the g-file. But again, both rook g6 and rook h6, both moves are perfectly fine. Now, white played b3, just trying to complete their development, and here black played pawn d6. I'm not sure why he didn't move the rook straight away. Maybe he wasn't sure which square to pick, g6 or h6, and he just decided to postpone that decision. Either way, pawn d6 is also a perfectly fine move to play. That is the part of our setup. We want to develop this knight, but we do not want to put it right here on c6, where it would block our own bishop, and therefore want to develop the knight right here to d7, and we prepare this by going pawn d6. So bishop b2, knight d7. And in this position, white played a very common mistake. Very often your opponent feels annoyed by the fact that you have the strong knight on their side of the board, which controls a lot of squares right there, and they want to trade it off or push it back somehow. And that is why white played knight e1. Sometimes with the same purpose they go knight d2. The idea being to play pawn f3 and to kick this knight away. And initially it seems like the move which makes perfect sense, and therefore we can't really blame our opponent for playing this move, and why would you blame your opponent for playing wrong moves anyway? But the idea here is that, yeah, of course, white, ideally speaking, would wish to get rid of this knight. But the downside is that they remove the key defender of their castling, this knight from f3. And now the king is kind of feeling lonely, which actually gives you a ton of attacking ideas. Now, black plays rook to h6. He uses the fact that this pawn on h2 is no longer guarded by the knight from f3 because there is no knight, and black wants to play queen h4 and possibly checkmate white. Also, this knight from f3 used to control these two important squares, making it not possible for your queen to jump out to one of these squares and join the party. But again, this is no longer the case. Your queen can move forward somewhere here or here, and in both cases, that'll add significant power to your attack. So that is what white not realized when they move the knight off the square f3, but most of your opponents will. Now, here white played g3. They just realized that queen h4 is coming, followed by queen h2 checkmate, and they need to counter that, so they played this move. Now, black played queen e8, which I don't fully understand, but it's more or less an okay move to play. Like, usually the idea is you want to bring your queen forward out of here, either to h4 or to g5. So if the h4 square is not available, I just bring it right here to g5. And although that perhaps does not create any straightforward threats, but overall you can just keep adding more pieces to your attack, and sure enough, quite soon they'll become dangerous for white. Moreover, sometimes in such positions, you can play an absolutely brilliant move queen h4, despite the fact that he's got the pawn on g3. You just brutally ignore that, creating the threat of queen takes h2, but if white captures it, you can then go rook g6 check, and if the king has to move, which often could be the case, then you're finishing the game in style with knight to f2 checkmate. This is a check by the knight, as well as by the sniper bishop on b7, which turns it into a checkmate because it's a double check. In this particular case, this combo would not work because white could cover with the knight from e1. That's why in this particular case it was not an option. But quite often it is an option. For instance, if white would move their knight not to e1, but to d2, then this combo would work perfectly for black and would allow black to win the game. Anyway, let's come back to the real game. Black played queen to e8. Not sure why, maybe he wanted to play queen g6 or support the e5 move. Anyway, white played bishop f3. He feels that there is a danger and he tries to bring some pieces closer. But black goes knight f6, another great move and also a very common maneuver. From here, we're repositioning the knight to a more active square, which supports our outpost knight on e4, but also from here the knight is ready to go to g4 and once again add more power to our attack. White played bishop g2, he's still desperately trying to cover his king, but here black won with a beautiful rook takes h2. And I wouldn't say that this is a sudden sacrifice. Black's got so many pieces pointing towards the king side that it's only natural that he wants to break open the position, get to the opponent's king and checkmate it. And that is exactly what happens after king takes. Yeah, black sacrificed the rook, but now the king is wide open, and so black can go knight g4 check, the king moves, now queen h5, threatening queen h2 checkmate. The only way to cover is knight f3, but still black would wish to force this checkmate, and the only thing they need to do is to get rid of this defending knight from f3. So they played another nice move, knight to c5, hitting the queen, but for the most part, they just want to open up the bishop so that we can grab the main defender, and then play queen h2 mate. And white is already defenseless. In the game, white did not take the knight, he played the move back, but taking the knight would not change anything, it would lead to the same thing. Bishop takes f3, threatening mate. White tried to provide some escape path for the king, but anyway, it's relatively easy for black. Queen h2, queen takes g2, grabbing more material, still checking the king. And now the king wants to escape right here. Black would win the game anyways, but knight e4 is the easiest. Now queen g1 is simply not unstoppable. The king is in this cage and black is winning the game. And here's a quick puzzle of the day. It is black to play and your task is to find a way to seize the advantage, to get some sort of an advantage. It's a common attacking pattern, but I think that if you find it on your own, you will also remember it better. Now here is the next game. Initially black started with e6, but then anyway transposed into the Dutch defense. Now notice that in most cases your opponents are going to develop the queenside knight first, and then you're going to play bishop b4 and pin the knight straight away. Sometimes, however, they will delay this move knight c3 for whatever reason, and then what do? You're just waiting for it to happen. Black played knight f6, and now sure enough white played knight to c3 in the game. If they don't, you can still play other moves that you plan to do anyway, for example, the fianchetto of your bishop, and again, they will usually bring the knight right here at some point, and as soon as they do this, you play bishop b4, pinning the knight because that's part of our plan. White played queen b3 to guard the knight and to put pressure down here, and I love the move a5 in this case, solidifying the bishop, and also this pawn can even be pushed forward in the future in some variations. In the game, he played queen e7, guarding the bishop that way, which is also fine. White plays g3, pawn b6, black wants to develop the bishop to this active diagonal. White castles, and we have seen this idea already. As soon as they castle away and this knight is no longer pinned, we want to grab it, because if you don't do this, sometimes they can start jumping forward and doing something with this knight, so we want to eliminate it. Now queen takes and black castles. White goes pawn b4. Naturally, in this setup, black wants to attack on the king side. We've got our bishop looking there. Thanks to our pawn on f5, we've got some space advantage. We're going to play knight e4 down the line. And therefore, white wants to counterattack on the queen side. And b4 aims to somehow attack later on the queen side. Black played a5, hitting this pawn. It's not that black really wants to attack on the queen side. It's rather the opposite. Black rather wants to keep the position closed. And by going a5, he says, hey, do you want to open up the file for my rook? If not, you can go b5, but then the situation is more locked on the queen side, making it harder for white to break open there, and that's what black wants. Black goes d6, completing their setup. We know that we usually want to bring our knight right here, and that is exactly what happens. Also, thanks to this setup, it makes it hard for white to play c5 at any point in the future and to start their own counterattack, because we just control this square so many times, making it very hard for white to do that. White played rook c1. He's still hoping that maybe somehow he'll be able to do that, but it's very hard. Black plays rook to e8, also just to bring the last piece into play, and maybe in some variations he could play pawn e5. I'd say that it's a secondary idea. Fundamentally, we want to go with knight e4, attack the queen, and bring more pieces to the king side and attack his king. That's our primary plan. But sometimes playing e5 is also not bad. You can expand in the center, maybe the pawn can even go forward, and your rook from e8 just supports this advancement. White played rook d1, which is a rookie error. We really love that stuff when he takes away pieces of his king, making it more vulnerable to our attack. But your opponents will never figure it out. And in this case, white player is a grandmaster. He still does this mistake because it's a very counterintuitive thing. Normally white would wish to bring the rook to the center, and it's the right thing to do. But in these variations, strangely enough, taking the rook off the king or taking the knight off the king often leaves this king lonely, in depression, needing, different medications, and it's sad stuff. So black goes knight e4, hitting the queen. Queen goes c2, and now knight comes to f6. And it's quite nice that within a couple moves, we brought this knight from the queen side all the way to the king side, and now we're ready to go knight g4. And from here, we're gonna hit this pawn on f2, which is no longer guarded by the rook, which used to be right there on f1. That's why I said that taking the rook right here often is a mistake, but white does not realize that. And right now, white already needs to do something about this threat. So they played knight e1, hoping to maybe play f3, but black says, you know what, I'm going to attack anyways. Knight g4, hitting this pawn. It turns out that white cannot really play this move pawn f3, because at first looks like that's a double attack of the knights and they're winning the game, but in reality it's the opposite. After knight to e3, we are the ones double attacking and winning material, and therefore white cannot do this. Instead, in the game, he played knight to d3, but right now at this point you can notice that black really mobilized all their forces. They brought up all the reserves they had. Now everything is looking towards the king side or is already on the king side. And at this point, usually you need to break open. And that's the stuff that we love the most. Go forward, sack, and mate. So he plays pawn f4, just trying to open up the lines and start a more serious attack. White took with the knight, and black just sacrificed the rook, once again aiming to break open the pawn shield around the king. And white realized that he can't actually take the rook, because if the rook is captured, black would play queen h4, creating all kinds of threats to these pawns, and white is already defenseless. For example, if h3 is played, you can just take this pawn, king h1, and knight g3 would be a common nightmare in chess. At the same time, we gotta give credit to the white player. He did not take the rook, and he instead played pawn f3, just trying to keep the situation complicated. And right now, black is up material. He grabbed that knight on f4. However, right now, 3 of his pieces are attacked, and he needs to find the way out. However, offense is the best defense, so he just played knight e3, also counter-attacking many pieces into the white position, and primarily the queen. The queen needs to move, and now black is at the crossroad, but he also followed an idea which I learned from Garry Kasparov. He said that if you want to identify whether your attack against his king is going to be successful or not, you just need to count the quantity of pieces involved into that area. So for instance, if we look at this particular square, how many of the white pieces and pawns are there, how many of the black pieces are attacking that region? And we will easily see that black can get a significant advantage. And he actually, instead of taking the rook, he grabbed the bishop right here, just to keep the king completely defenseless. After white recaptures, now the king has no defenders, only a couple pawns, and black can keep attacking. Therefore, he goes queen g5, another great move. He brings the queen into the attack, also pins the pawn so that he can't take the rook, and just simply adds more firepower. Now we can see that it's basically a single king against almost all of the pieces are black, because this bishop is active, the knight is active, these pieces are active. Only the rook on e8 is no longer involved into the attack, but black can also easily bring it right here. By the way, if you want to learn more of these attacking ideas so that you can find proper attacking moves on your own, I've got a free masterclass where I cover that. You can find it by clicking the link below the video and checking it out later. Now, for now, after queen g5, for white it's still not easy to realize what to do. He can't take this knight. That would be a blunder. After bishop takes e4, we would double attack the king and queen. But otherwise, what can he do? Well, he played c5, which is actually a common move that sooner or later your opponent will likely to play if they want to create a counterattack. And it's also important to know how to react. Black played a brilliant move here, because the natural reaction of black is trying to take this pawn. Because if you don't, maybe white can even play c6 and shut down this bishop completely. But as soon as you start taking this pawn on c5, there are some bad things that happen to your position, because now their bishop is open. There is no pawn on d4, which obstructed the bishop earlier. Now their pieces have the d-file that they can use, and they have indeed this counterattack. Therefore, in the real game, black played the move which is worth remembering. He said, you know what, if the main threat is pawn c6 to shut down my bishop, let me just go bishop d5. And now if you want to go c6, go ahead, that doesn't do anything. And if white trades, that's not a problem, because this pawn is already guarded. And basically we just maintain the situation as it is. Nevertheless, white gets a little bit of a positive thing here, because at least they opened up one file, and they can now go inside with rook c7 and try to do something. But in reality, it's not dangerous, because white has no threats anyway, and black goes rook g4, playing another brilliant sacrifice of the rook. He's just brutally opening the position after rook takes g3. That's what he intends to do. And it's nice how black is just ignoring everything. So white could take here or here, but black just keeps ignoring it. If pawn takes e4, we already know that black just recaptures, hitting the king and queen, winning material. And if white were to capture on g4, that would once again open up this diagonal, allowing black all kinds of discovered checks. For instance, knight c5, check to the king, and attack of the queen, and black would also win something here, probably the game. Now white tried to go king f1, trying to somehow escape, but black just played rook to f8, bringing his last piece into play. And on the next move, after king e1 and rook takes g3, white just resigned. Now rook g1 is coming, and if he takes, queen takes. Notice that our knight is still doing a great job, not letting white to escape. And after king f1 and queen f2, for instance, that is a checkmate. In this game, I started off with knight to f3, but the beauty of the Dutch defense is that you can play f5 after virtually any move of white except pawn e4. So black still went for it, and that transitioned into the normal Dutch defense. Knight c3, as soon as the knight is out, we play bishop b4, developing our bishop to this active square. White played bishop d2 to oppose it, but we don't care, we do our thing. a3, white has to spend quite a lot of time just to deal with this bishop on b4, but we don't mind, because anyway we are intending to trade on c3 at some point, and therefore if your opponent has to waste a lot of moves just to cope with this threat, we're okay with that. So we trade, and now we've got this bishop on e4. There is no white knight that controls, therefore we can land our own knight there. For queen c2, he played pawn d6. I prefer playing b6 and bishop b7 first, putting the bishop to an open diagonal, but it's not that critical ultimately. He played b6 anyway, so that would transpose into the usual setup, knight to d7. So that is the setup that you want to achieve. And what do you do then in the middle game? Rook f6. You do the rook lift to the king side, and you start attacking there. Now white played bishop b2, securing the bishop so that maybe you can never capture it, even though probably we were not going to do it anyway. Black played rook h6, and now white goes c5. Now we already know this stuff. White is even ready sometimes to sacrifice the pawn right here just to open up lines, to start counterattack, and to start bothering you. And usually it's best not to accept this pawn sacrifice, because if we start counting attackers and defenders, like this pawn has 1, 2, 3 defenders, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers. Therefore, theoretically we could take it. But the thing is, after this whole thing is traded, even though you could win a pawn, but guess what? Now he's got this file for his rook, another file for his rook. The bishop is active along this diagonal, and for just a little pawn, he's got so many attacking ideas that we just do not want that. Luckily, there is a standard idea to cope with this attack. We know that c6 is actually the main threat we gotta be worried about, and therefore we just play bishop d5, and we keep the situation as it is. Now after this, white traded on d6, black recaptured with a knight. I'm not entirely sure why. In most cases, you should capture with a c pawn, because if you do that, you also keep controlling this square. His knight cannot go there, and after that, you just keep doing your attack. In the game, however, he captured with a knight, and yeah, I'm not a fan of this, but it's okay. White goes b5, he still tries to create some sort of a counter-attack on the queen side. And now black played an interesting move. Now, in one of the previous games, we talked about the fact that very often your opponent will move this knight away somehow. Knight d2, knight e1, because usually you've got your knight on e4, this one, and they're trying to contest it somehow. However, what if they never move this knight away? Well, there's a little bit of a problem, because ideally you'd wish to play something like queen h4, queen h2 mate, but this annoying knight from f3 controls all these squares, making it harder for you to attack. So what do? Sometimes you can be bold and just play g5, g4 and kick this knight away brutally and just expand on the king side. White anticipated g4 move to come, and they played knight e5 straight away. In the game, black took this knight, but in reality, quite often you can deal with his attack just by ignoring it. So I think that it would be even better for black just to ignore the thing completely and play g4, queen h4, just do your thing. As those motivational speakers say, be you, do you. So ignore what he does. That would be, I think, the best approach. He traded on e5 first, but after that he actually did the same thing. Instead of moving the knight, he said, okay, I'm just gonna go g4. And if you want to grab the knight, go ahead and do that. The thing is, black wants to play queen h4, queen h2 mate, and therefore he's willing to sack this knight on d6. White played g3, taking control of this square so that the queen cannot move forward to that square. But of course, there is an obvious downside to moving the pawn to g3. Now, all these light squares around the king are very weak, and we're going to take advantage of that. Black played queen g5. We also talked about that thing earlier, and you can see that the same attacking patterns occur across various different situations. If your queen cannot be brought to h4, then you can use the so-called second best option, right? Queen to g5 thing, which is slightly less active, but still you bring the queen to the king side. And white actually grabbed this knight on d6 at this point. Probably he anticipated black to play queen h5, trying to checkmate this way, and he came up with the great solution, pawn h4. Very tricky move, because even if black is aware of the en passant capture, he cannot do that because the pawn is pinned down to the king. That would allow white to completely shut down the black attack and be up knight in a winning position. However, black prepared an unpleasant surprise. Instead of playing queen h5 straight away, he sacked the rook right here on h2. Now rook h1 checkmate is coming, but if the rook is captured, here comes queen h5 check, the king has to move, which leads to this queen h1 checkmate. Going back one move in the actual game, white played f3. He calculated that he can't take the rook, he tried to do something else and block the rook h1 threat. However, black just ignores that, pawn takes f3, this time queen takes g3 is coming, so white captured the rook anyways, but now queen h5 check, the king has to move, pawn takes c2, threatening rook and also threatening this check. White played queen c3. He's still trying to find some chances. He's actually preparing this counter checkmate. So black is trying to deliver a checkmate and white is trying the same. But after queen h1, the king has to move. Queen g2. Once again, it's the only square for the king to move to is here. And at this point, black can magically point this rook black, like recruit it and make it work for black with whoops, and it's a checkmate. If you missed my first video about this opening where I go more in depth about the opening, exactly how to play it, check out this video right here. I think it's going to be very enlightening. And if you want to, generally speaking, become a great attacking player, learn how to find all these moves and combinations on your own and play openings well without the need to memorize them, check out the free masterclass by clicking the link right there or in the description below the video. Either way, have a great rest of the day.